Hello, good morning, Cinnamon Bun. We're going to talk about D&D while I have breakfast. Let's do it. Okay. I feel like I definitely just dipped my hair in butter. The hazards of the curls. So actually it wasn't that recently now. I recently ran my first couple of sessions of D&D using the Monster of the Week system. You might have already seen my video about creating the monster for that game. We're just going to chat a little bit about how that went, how it was GMing for the first time. Because like I said, I've never played any tabletop role-playing game or GM'd or DM'd anything. This was my first time giving it a go. So we're just going to talk about how that went and how I found it. And I'm going to give you like the rough kind of shape of what the story was and how it played out, what the players ended up doing, how they resolved it, and then we're going to get into some questions that people had. As always, first coffee of the day, so hopefully I will get more cogent as this video goes on. We are a bit overexposed, aren't we? So we were doing a Monster of the Week game. I think I just called it the Harlow Hunt, this game, or this campaign. And it was meant to be a one-shot, so it was meant to be a small story that would fit in one probably about 5-hour session of play. We did not manage to complete it in that time because I think I maybe just had a bit too much going on, and so we ended up doing it in 2 sessions, one Saturday after the other. This ended up being like maybe between 10 and 12 hours of total playtime. Which was a lot. But yeah, so after the first session, I did a big, I took a bunch of notes on everything that happened so that I could use that to prepare for the next session. After the second session, I didn't do that, and I really gutted that I didn't make a bunch of notes of everything that happened, because now it's been over a month since that game and I don't remember everything as well. But I think I was just so exhausted after it that I just never got around to it. So the setting for this story is we kind of zoomed in on the small coastal town of Fairfield, Connecticut, the kind of residential autumn leaves kind of area where the Harlow family live. And we zoomed in on the Harlow house. The Harlow family stick out a little bit in their neighbourhood. They are a bit odd. And we started with them at the breakfast table. And I actually I used that kind of little framing device to get everyone to introduce their characters. So I had everyone like tell us who their character was, and I also had them like explain what they're doing at the breakfast table, what are they having for breakfast, like what's their routine and stuff, so we could just get a little bit of grounding on the family. And then we went straight into the inciting incident. So the inciting incident was the Harlow family hear a scream from outside, just like that siren. The Harlow family hear a scream from outside, and when they get outside, they see that their neighbour, Aileen Ray, across the road, is standing at her front door, looking down at her doorstep, and she has just screamed. And what they discover is that someone or something has placed on her doorstep a platter of we ended up calling it the cat platter, which is just kind of awful, but it's basically this platter of like sliced meat, and it has like a garnish of herbs and some sauce and stuff, but the meat itself is raw and it has fur along one edge, and it has a threatening note attached to Aileen Ray, and the meat we observe or figure out is actually her cat. Someone has killed her cat and is now using it to threaten her. The Harlows immediately kind of like jump into action. So they question her a bit and ask if there's anyone who might want to hurt her. They find out that she is having some money troubles, and she is actually in arrears with her mortgage and stuff. So she's in a lot of debt. She hasn't been paying her mortgage. Her house is actually going to be foreclosed on pretty soon. The Harlows I think they take 2 sort of leads from that. They're like, maybe we should go talk to the bank, and also the Homeowners Association. Something that I was really happy that we managed to slide in immediately at the beginning is that I created this lamppost sign that was posted around the neighbourhood from the Homeowners Association, detailing what is approved by the Homeowners Association and what's prohibited. And it's just like a general reminder of like, remember that you need to adhere to these regulations. They found that sign basically immediately. And so I sent them, I actually had a digital version of it so they could refer to it again. And that was really helpful, like foreshadowing for later and stuff. So they decided to pursue the Homeowners Association, and they do that by finding out where the Homeowners Association is based, the committee is based, which is in a building in town, Post Road offices. I think they also find out in that first investigation just on the street that Alien Ray's cat has been killed, but there are also a few neighbourhood dogs that have gone missing in the past few months. Got a little bit ahead of myself there, but I've refreshed my coffee and we're going to start again. Rundown of who was playing. So we had 4 player characters. Around the Harlow breakfast table we had James playing as Barney, who's playing the professional. So Barney is a professional, like 9-to-5 monster hunter, just kind of long-suffering bureaucracy, duster jackets, just like pinching the bridge of your nose. I feel like that's like the Barney vibe. And then we had Freya being played by Jack, my little brother. Freya was the child of the family, so Barney was one of the parents. Freya was the daughter. Freya is a 13-year-old girl. She is the crooked. So that it was the crooked playbook. So Freya had like this really big Artemis Fowl energy. She's like a 13-year-old crime boss. So she's been running like this kind of criminal organization through her school, and she has all of these resources and stuff from doing that. So that was a lot of fun. She also carries a baseball bat because she's into baseball. I am going to check with Jen if we can use the characteristics that she put together because they're fucking great. And then we had Malkaz, who's being played by my friend Jen. So of our 4 players, Malkaz was the only one playing as a spirit instead of a human, which means that powers and magic work a little bit differently. But we have Malkaz the monstrous, who is a spirit. Malkaz is basically like a smoky demon. So we're using demon with an A. Malkaz was a spirit of a mafia, like a crime family, so very violent and stuff. And basically through a series of interesting events in Barney's past has ended up making like a blood deal, like some kind of deal with Barney. I think it was to protect the family. I can't even remember now. But basically Malkaz is this weird dark spirit who is now part of the family, and has been for a long time. And so we had this vibe of like Malkaz kind of ends up being like another parent to Freya, and has maybe influenced Freya and maybe taught Freya some of the crime lord stuff that she has learned. So yeah, demonic babysitter vibes for Malkaz. And Malkaz has 2 forms as well, this kind of smoky demon, and then this kind of mysterious lady. So we had Gregor playing as Alcatraz the Flake, who we ended up mainly calling Al, because Malkaz and Alcatraz got a little bit confusing at times. I think Jen basically described Alcatraz as Fox Mulder turned up to 100. Al used to work at the FBM with Barney, the Federal Bureau of Monsters, or the Federal Bureau of Magical Crime is the official name, but saw some shit and had to quit because they couldn't hack it anymore. Those are the Harlows. That's the Harlow family. And now I'm going to get back into what actually happened. So they head to Post Road offices where the Homeowners Association committee is based, and they investigate there. They try and find out what's going on. They end up meeting Gerald, who is a long-standing member of the Homeowners Association committee. He's also one of their neighbours. They ask him about what's been going on, and he doesn't really give them a lot. Yes, but they do get a bit of a lead in. They find something about Beth and Lawrence Woodhaw, who are also on the committee and also live on their street, and so I think they decide to pursue that further. So having kind of exhausted everything they could find at the Post Road offices, they then head back to the house. I did a bit of a time skip to the evening because I wanted the next stuff to happen in the evening. They question one of their neighbours, Mrs. Abernathy, and ask her if she's seen anything weird. And she talks about maybe having seen what she calls a hedge monster. They don't know what that is. They get home. After their investigation, they get a text from Aileen Ray who says that she thinks she saw someone following her home, and they suspect that it might be Lawrence Woodhaw. So they take Aileen and her son Jamie back to the Harlow house across the road for the night to protect them, basically. So we have this kind of sleepover vibe, but they also decide to split up. So Malkaz, our smoky demon, decides to stake out the Woodhaw home and see like what's going on and what they do and investigate there, while the rest of the Harlows stay at the Harlow house and protect Aileen and Jamie. So Malkaz does some investigating at the Woodhaw house and finds some suspicious stuff. It looks like one of them has been communing with some kind of spirit, but they don't really know what it is. But before they can find out anything more, they hear a gunshot from down the road because something is happening at the Harlow house. The Harlows are settling down for the night. A couple of people are sleeping on couches and stuff because they've got extra people. They've got Aileen and Jamie. They hear rustling outside, and when Barney looks out the window, he sees a huge poodle made out of hedgerow stalking up the path to the front door. So this was my first minion, and his name is Binkles. He is a spirit, and he is nasty. So they get into this fight with Binkles. They try shooting it, they try burning it, and nothing seems to really do all that much. And eventually someone does I think it's a read a bad situation roll. And they realise that maybe Binkles is weak to garden tools since it is made of hedgerow. So they're fighting this giant hedgerow poodle who takes a chunk out of Al basically immediately. Malkaz is kind of wrestling with it and trying to claw it, but it has these giant like thorny teeth that kind of like burrow in if it locks its jaws around you. That was a custom move that I came up with, is that if it manages to bite you, then it'll lock jaws, and then you're like caught in a grapple basically, and its thorny teeth will kind of continue to spiral into your flesh unless you can break free of it. And that happened to a couple of our hunters. Some shit happened in this fight, you guys. Yeah, so Freya thinks that if they try and set it on fire, since it's a hedge, that might work, and so puts together a Molotov from the liquor cabinet, tries to light the Molotov by shooting it, misses, shoots a hole in the ceiling, cuts her hand. Barney, her father, is like, we have matches in the kitchen, what are you doing? Why are you trying to shoot that to light it? But eventually they do manage to light the Molotov and set Binkles alight, but it doesn't seem to do all that much. They end up running through the house, retreating a bit. Binkles follows them out into the back garden and they fight some more there. Yeah, there was this quite cool moment where Binkles was in the middle of leaping towards Freya, and Malkaz manages to intercept it, basically crashes into it and bites down on its neck with these like long black smoky teeth, and actually splinters Binkles' neck, so the wood is kind of cracked and it's kind of hanging off at one side. They get the shed open and argue about what to try and use against it garden tool wise. They decide to try and use a tub of fence paint to put out the fire and then use the lawnmower to kill it. And then we have this like absolute farce of, I had them act under pressure to try and just open the tin of fence paint, and we had two different characters try to do it, but they're too panicked and they just can't. So Alcatraz tries to open the paint with a knife and just fumbles it and it rolls across the grass, and then we had this like almost sweet moment between Freya and Al where Freya goes up to Al and takes Al's face in Freya's hands and goes, "You can do this because you're my dad." I'm trying to like psych them up. I think that was to use it's not the help action in Monster of the Week, but it's you can still help someone. Al rolls again to try and do it and just doesn't work. But finally Barney gets a hold of the tin, manages to pry it open, and swings the paint at Binkles, the hedgerow demonic poodle. As soon as it hits Binkles, it starts to dissolve. It just kind of like melts into this like green sludge with like lumps of hedge and stuff. They have defeated Binkles! Hooray! And the entire family just kind of flops down on the grass, exhausted, and that is where we ended our first session. Okay, what happened next? So session 1, I had like a breakdown of everything that happened, so I had all those notes. Session 2, I did not do that. So this is going to be a bit more amorphous. But basically, so I think what they did next was we had them sleep, and then the next day they went out to find Lawrence Woodhaw, who they know has been communicating with this spirit somehow. I think what they found out, what Mal actually found out from investigating the Woodhaw house, is that it didn't look like Lawrence Woodhaw was commanding the spirit. It looked like he was actually taking orders from the spirit with this shrine that he had set up in their like office, their home office. So they set out to find Lawrence Woodhaw and figure out what the fuck's going on. They find him at this bakery in town and they start to question him. He is not having it. He is basically giving them nothing. So they basically bundle him into Barney's van and drive out to the kind of this like quiet kind of marsh area in Fairfield. They question him as much as they can. I can't even remember what it is that they found out from him now. Things escalate and they basically end up in a fight together. Lawrence is human, but he's a magic caster. So yeah, they have that fight and it ends. They basically, someone had managed to slit his throat, and so he was basically bleeding out, and they were figuring out what to do with him when Al just straight up shot him in the head, just killed him, and they left his body in the marsh and then headed out to, I think by this point they had started to suspect Gerald. I think they'd also sent Aileen, Ray and Jamie away by this point to protect them. They were like, can you go and stay with your sister out of town until this blows over and we can figure out who's doing this and who's trying to hurt you. They stop in at 2 places before they head back to confront Gerald, who they now think is the spirit of the Homeowners Association. They stop in past the hardware store and buy a bunch of like gardening and hardware gear to use against him. They try and pick some of the things that are prohibited by the HOA from that list. So they've got a chainsaw, they've got these big secateurs, they've got more fence paint, that really like bright, saturated, like dark green that you get on fences. They pick all that up from the hardware store, load it into the van, and then they stop off at Dairy Queen to rest up a little bit. And everyone, we just did a round robin of like, what is your exact order from Dairy Queen? And they kind of like gear up for this final fight, eating it out of the back of the van. Then they headed back to the Harlow house and to Gerald's house, which is right next door. I can't remember exactly even how the fight starts, but Gerald is home, and I think Freya goes into his garden and starts doing something. He has like a prize rose bush that I had actually created as a weakness for him. So if you attack the rose bush with one of the prohibited items, then you can kill him, basically. That's not what they did though. They hadn't figured that out yet. So I think they just started fucking shit up in his garden. And so he comes out of the house and starts attacking Freya, and then before you know it, we're in the final battle. They try a bunch of... they get pretty fucked up by him. They try a bunch of different things before I finally kind of hint at them to read a bad situation to try and figure out his weaknesses. And they realise... I think, what was it? It was Al that rolled for it. And I said, you notice that every single thing in Gerald's house and garden is HOA approved and regulation. And so they start to figure out ways that they can fuck that up, and then eventually they realise that it's not just fucking up his stuff, that they need to actually use the prohibited stuff against him somehow, like he's weak to that. And so there's a bunch of different ways that they can do that. I think someone chopped off one of his arms with a chainsaw, because chainsaws are prohibited. So Gerald is like summoning all of this crazy shit to throw at them. He is like summoning like wheelie bins and mailboxes and this entire like hedgerow which kind of like flies through the air like this big snake and wraps around Barney and starts to crush him. And the kind of main event is, or his biggest summoning is that near the end of the fight, he's pinned on the grass along with a couple of the other players are also on the grass, and he summons a spirit kind of version of the entire roof of his house. It like emerges and it floats above them, and he crashes it down on all of them, and he actually damages himself just to get that hit on everyone else, and everyone takes a big hit, which I thought was pretty cool. And eventually they do manage to defeat him, and it's funny because they kill Lawrence completely in cold blood, but when it comes to Gerald, they actually pin him and basically get him arrested by the FBM. So I think it's Al manages to do some magic to create these manacles that are going to hold Gerald, because he's a spirit, they need to be strange ones. So we had Al use magic to do that. And I think they actually ended up creating them out of the Homeowners Association like notice that was on the lampposts. So the list of things that are approved and prohibited, they basically took a bunch of those and magicked them into this like kind of twisted, these like manacles made out of all of these twisted bits of paper and magic. Barney called the FBM for an extraction, and they came along, and some guys came and took him away. And as our final kind of wrap up, we basically had the Harlows kind of limp back inside, and then we saw them basically have like a cozy, restful night in. So they ordered pizza, they watched Pacific Rim, and they also got a text from Aileen Ray saying that, oh, someone's house burned down. I forgot about that at some point. Lawrence Woodhaw burned down Aileen Ray's house to prevent the foreclosure, but it actually ended up working out in Aileen's favour. They managed to verify that it wasn't her fault, that someone else had committed arson, basically. She could get the insurance money for that, and so she wasn't going to basically be chucked out on the street. So we had that kind of little like tying things up kind of happy ending of like the Aileen and Jamie Ray story. So that's how it all went down. So let's get into some questions. Okay, so we had some questions. So S. Rachael asks, is it difficult to do a game? How long do they normally last? These are such big questions, my friend. Is it difficult to do a game? I've only done 2 sessions, so honestly, I'm not really equipped to tell you. I found it quite intense, but it was also really fun and worth it. It's one of those things that it just takes practice. I basically I did a bunch of research. I looked up a bunch of stuff and consumed a bunch of content about how to run a game. In particular, my brother has always recommended me Matthew Colville's videos, and his are really great. I watched a lot of that, and I really like what he says. He encourages people to try GMing or DMing, and he says it's not difficult, you just need to learn how to do it. It just takes practice. That's the way that I was trying to think about it. As for how long does it normally last, like how long do you want to play for? That's completely up to you. Our sessions went really long, so we were like 5 or 6 hours, but you could just do 2-hour sessions. Are you running a long-term campaign, which is going to be a bunch of sessions, for a bunch of weeks or months, or are you doing like a one-off? So Lacewings asked, what was your process to prep for a session? You'll see a lot of this, like I said, in that I did a D&D prep vlog where I created Gerald the monster. That took an entire day, so that was a lot of work. The other stuff, I basically just followed the instructions in Monster of the Week. I started out with a basic concept of what if you put the Addams family in Stars Hollow, and I really liked the idea of a team concept of a family, which were like weird but very functional and happy, which is not really what we ended up getting, but it still ended up being good. That was the first concept, and I just started building stuff around it like that. I basically used the Monster of the Week book, the stuff that you're meant to have done, as a checklist, and I worked through it, creating stuff for it the way I would for any story or anything I work on, which is just by brainstorming. which is just by unearthing a bunch of different possibilities and then picking one that I like. But I guess in terms of prep, I started out with that family concept, and then I moved to like, well, where is this set? So I decided it was going to be modern day in a kind of alternate fantasy world, Fairfield, Connecticut, and then I started to look on Google Maps and flesh out some of the setting and stuff from there. The setting stuff was great because I just picked a real town and I used Google Maps and I used all the real locations from it and just kind of like edited little bits here and there. So that saved me a lot of time on world building. And then I had to create like the countdown for the mystery, the monster, and a bunch of bystander and minion characters and stuff. And I just followed all of the instructions in the Monster of the Week book. Okay, so Miss Post asks the pros and cons of such an interactive mode of storytelling versus more traditional methods such as novel writing. I'm really fascinated with that question. Like, what are the pros and cons of such a different mode of storytelling? Yeah, I'm used to novel writing. I'm used to being like the sole creator of my stories, and so doing something interactive where I'm like a co-creator was really exciting, and it was really cool to think about, like, to just create this environment, create these antagonists that were gonna, you know, like run things and do things their own way, and finding out like how the heroes were going to react to that and how it was going to play out. That was really cool. I also think that there's something, it is different, but there's something so awesome about the immediacy of storytelling through D&D or tabletop games. If I'm writing a novel, I am writing that by myself for at least months, sometimes often years, before I get any feedback on it, before I get any of the kind of, like, there's the reward of the writing process itself if you enjoy it and if you can make it fun. But for me, a big part of it is sharing my stories and getting to hear what people think and how they react and stuff. And that is a process that takes a long time with a novel. It's a long time before that you have to work on it and finish it before people can see it, before you can actually get feedback from people. And that, I find feedback really motivating. I mean, obviously everyone loves good feedback. Everyone loves praise. But I love that with D&D, you are co-creating a story, which you then get to, in the next session, immediately see how people react to it in the moment and experience it in a different way from novels or other storytelling mediums. There's something very attractive about that to me, especially as I've mentioned a bunch of times, I think, in recent videos now. I'm pretty sure I have ADHD, working on getting a diagnosis, but that makes perfect sense as, like, it's immediate gratification as opposed to delayed gratification. Of, like, you know, working on something in solitude and then eventually, by the time you're absolutely sick of it, then letting it float out into the world. Yeah. Did your players ever take the game or narrative in a direction that you were completely unprepared for or not expecting? Yes, immediately, which is, I'm sure, not a surprise to anyone who's played a tabletop RPG. The first thing was that, like, they immediately went off to the Homeowners Association offices, which I hadn't actually expected to need to run anything there. So I had like a building picked out on Google Maps for it, and I had nothing inside. So I had to improv basically everything that they found there. And it was a bit of a dead end. Like, I managed to, like, give them some stuff to move the story forward, but it was a struggle. And that was like the first thing they did after the inciting incident, so that was kind of stressful. But then they also, I think, said later on, I remember at the end of that session, James, who was playing Barney, was like, yeah, I don't know if we should have gone there. It seemed like that wasn't necessarily the best thing to do. And that was interesting because I'm like, oh yeah, of course, the players don't see it. Like, I'm all-knowing and omnipotent to them, so if they didn't find anything there, then they're like, oh, we shouldn't have gone there, not, Rachael, why didn't you have anything planned for that area? We got through it. So that was one of the main things, was that, yeah, I was really not prepared for them to go there and investigate there and actually find stuff that was useful. The other thing was that I was absolutely shocked that they killed Lawrence Woodhaw just in cold blood. I mean, so Lawrence Woodhaw, his character, he was basically a low-level like sociopath. He was working for Gerald. He's a member of the Homeowners Association committee and is like really committed to preserving he's also a real estate broker. He sold the Harlows their house, and so he has this vested financial interest in like maintaining the value of the neighborhood, which would have taken a big hit basically if Aileen's house had been foreclosed upon. It would have reduced the value of all the properties nearby, which was basically the motive for the antagonist. So he was a piece of shit, and I made him be that way, and his wife Beth, I think they actually thought she was a villain as well, but then they spoke to her and they were like, oh no, she's fucking terrified of him. Yeah, I was like, this guy's a piece of shit, but he's still just a human being, and this is like, you know, pretty close to the real world. And so when they killed him, I was like, fuck, okay then. And then I was like, what happens when you just murder someone in this world? What's gonna happen to his body? Do I now have to involve the police and stuff? So that was like, yeah. And was improv harder or more fun than you were thinking it would be? I think that, so like my first time GMing, where I feel like my strengths and weaknesses lay, or what I found easy or difficult, I found actually narrating what was happening pretty easy. I felt like I slipped into that very easily. So like even in combat and stuff, like actually describing what was happening, especially with the fight with Binkles, I was really happy with the way that I managed to explain what was happening and make things kind of visceral, and they seemed actually quite afraid of Binkles, which made me very happy. But the role-playing stuff was difficult for me, which I think, I didn't know exactly how that would go, but it makes sense. I don't think I'm a very good actor in the tiny like instances that I've done stuff like that in my life. I don't think I'm very good at it. And so role-playing the characters and doing their dialogue and figuring out how they would react to things was harder. Yeah, it was harder. I think I did an okay job with Aileen, but she didn't have that much of a character, to be honest. She was just like a victim for them to protect. Her son Jamie, I think I did maybe okay. They had a conversation with Gerald, which I think I was so focused on like, how can I give them the next breadcrumbs of this investigation, that I was maybe more focused on that than the character stuff. So trying to balance that was kind of tricky. I think my favourite bit of role-playing that I did, actually, my favourite line was, I can't even remember what it was that Barney said, but as they were kind of wrapping up the conversation, Barney said something along the lines of, yeah, I'd like to speak further about, you know, maybe changing some of these regulations. And I had Gerald basically reach out and shake his hand and be like, absolutely not, thanks for coming in. Yeah, so the improv role-playing dialogue stuff was probably one of the hardest parts for me. Again, I think it's one of those things that you always just get better with practice at. But yeah, trying to just jump between characters who I think it maybe would have been easier if I'd built them out more. I didn't know all that much about the characters. I tried to just whip up as much stuff as quickly as possible. Improvising might have been easier if I had fleshed out my characters a bit more. Squiddy Mabob asked, what was the balance between combat and more story-focused bits? How did you make sure any combat was not slow and dull? So this is something that again is a bit different in Monster of the Week from traditional D&D. In traditional D&D, the way I understand it, you plan a lot more of how things are going to play out. You plan an encounter that they're going to have, and then like a role-playing bit that they're going to have and stuff. Whereas Monster of the Week, it's very much just like setting up the pieces on the chessboard and then seeing what the fuck they do and reacting to that. So it's kind of more fluid in that way. You don't really plan specific encounters and stuff. They spent most of the time... Well, no, actually, I think the balance might have ended up being like maybe 2/3 role-playing and 1/3 combat or something. Up front, at the start of the investigation, they did a lot of role-playing and a lot of investigating, and then it was only like that last section of the first session where they fought Binkles, which we had combat. And that was like a decent sized bit of combat, I think. And I was actually pretty happy with how that ended up playing out. The next session, they had all the conflict with Lawrence Woodhaw, and then they ended up fighting him. That was a really quick piece of combat because it was 1 against 4, and he wasn't ever really designed to be like a big combat challenge. Like, he was a minion. And then it was gearing up and then fighting Gerald, and the Gerald fight did go on for a fair amount, and I do wish that I'd maybe, I don't know, I think we rolled too many kick some ass kind of bouts in a row, and I wish I'd been able to maybe vary it up a little bit more, but we got there in the end. As for how do you make sure any combat is not slow and dull, in Monster of the Week you don't do individual moves in the same way. It's not like you throw a punch and then you roll to attack and stuff for that. You roll to kick some ass, and that basically is meant to cover an entire bout of fighting in which you will definitely take damage and the monster or the minion will definitely take damage unless you have modifiers and stuff that preclude that. And then I kind of narrate how it plays out. And we did have a bunch of those in a row, which, I don't know. But then I think they were also trying to unravel this mystery of like, how do you actually harm him? What is his weakness? So I think that adds some more interest to it. But I did feel like it did get a bit repetitive of like, oh, Gerald's going to summon something now and throw it at you. Which is not quite as interesting. But I think the trial and error process of them trying different things out on him and seeing what worked and what didn't kind of kept it interesting. And I think also combat in Monster of the Week is maybe a bit more deadly than in D&D. So that definitely keeps things tense as well, is that like they took some really hard hits, and people had pretty low, like they took a lot of harm, which is how it works in Monster of the Week. And so things did feel a bit touch and go at points. And I actually ended up kind of paring back some of Gerald's attacks a bit, to kind of walk that line so that I didn't just absolutely decimate them. But I was happy to do that because it still felt like the fight had been a real challenge. So Russell has a bit more of a kind of mechanical question, which is just like coordinating and supporting everyone's attention for an interactive story. Did you have small breaks incorporated into the experience? Yes, we went for, like, I would not do sessions that long again by choice, I don't think. The reason that our sessions ended up going that long was because we had only planned to do one and to try and wrap up the entire story in one session, and that wasn't happening. So I think it's probably easier to manage the length of the sessions and stuff if you're just committed to finishing the story, no matter how many sessions that takes. Whereas we were trying to cram everything into 2 sessions because we didn't know if we'd be able to actually get everyone together again. So yeah, we did take breaks. We would just stop. I would just call it and say, hey, let's take a 5-10 minute break. Especially if someone had something they needed to figure out if they were going to do, that was usually a good point for that. I would have liked to even have taken a longer break than that, maybe a half hour in the middle, but we didn't actually end up doing that. So I definitely wish that I had more food prepped for that session because I did not eat enough. But yeah, you got to take those breaks. Rachel asked, how did you use your knowledge of stories to help you, and where did it cause issues in a live character setting? So yeah, this is something that I'm kind of interested in. Obviously, story structure is my thing, but that's not really how, when you're writing a story by yourself, you can create all of the structure. That's not how it works in D&D and stuff. Like, it's a game. It's not like a pre-planned story. So, or not to the same extent, at least. So I came into this just being like, I'm not going to try and create a plot embryo for this, because that's not how this really works. I'd maybe consider experimenting with something like that in future if I was going to do a larger campaign. But I basically thought of it as what I call a plot trigon. So my Story Magic Academy students will know what I'm talking about here, but a trigon is just the 3 smallest or most basic components of a story, which is you need to have a motive, you need to have a conflict, and you need to have a resolution. And I created the motive and the conflict, and then I figured out, and then we let it play out, and we saw like how are they going to react to the conflict and how are they going to resolve it. So it's this, yeah, it's a co-creation. It's a bit of it's teamwork and it's a tug of war at the same time. So I was just really focused on like, how can I create the best antagonist, the most interesting antagonist that I want to run, and really create a challenge for them to rise to, hopefully. So I think I think it worked out fine because I just didn't come at it thinking that it was going to be like a novel, because it's just not. Yeah, I tried to take the advice of much more seasoned GMs, and I tried to just stick to creating the stuff that I needed to for the Monster of the Week game. Yeah, and it seemed to work out fine. I did kind of want to, my temptation, especially after the first session, was like, how can I give the players opportunities for character development? Because I'd started to kind of identify maybe what kind of themes and arcs might be going on with them after that first session. And so I made some notes on that, but in 2 sessions you just don't have space for that. If we were going to run a longer campaign, then I would focus a lot more on how can we work with themes and ideology in this, and how can I give them opportunities to develop as characters and change instead of remaining static. I think there was some tiny changes, but yeah, in the scale of just like that one-shot story, there's not really a lot of space for that. So Kyla asked, how much did you plan versus how much did you use? I think for the most part, I'm actually pretty happy with that ratio, with how much I ended up planning versus using. The one place where I maybe did a little bit more than I needed to was in terms of locations. So like I said, I set the story in Fairfield, Connecticut, which is a small town. I used Google Maps to find like interesting locations that I thought were cool. I basically ended up copying and saving a bunch of references for like a ton of places on the main street, so the shops and bars and restaurants and cafes and all of that, just because I found a lot of them quite interesting. So I had this huge list, which they ended up going to like 3 locations or something like that. So I think that was maybe a bit overboard, and I could have narrowed that down by just picking like where the next clues were going to be and building out those locations a little bit further. I think for the most part, yeah, it was pretty even. I didn't feel like there was a ton of stuff wasted, but I'm really ruthless about world building in my other work. When it comes to writing, I'm like story over world building every single day of the week. And so obviously running a D&D game, you need to do a certain amount of world building, because you are the world, you are the physics of the world, and you need to understand that to be able to run it consistently. So you definitely do need to do more world building for D&D or tabletop RPGs than other kinds of stories, like solo stories, novels and short stories and stuff. But I always try to err on the side of not having enough and just improvising rather than overbuilding. And so I think I got that balance fairly well. A couple of things that I was a bit bummed that I didn't get to use was that I gave Binkles this really cool ability that I completely forgot to use in the moment, and I guess I couldn't really think of how to. So Binkles was the spirit of Gerald's home, and he was this hedgerow poodle, kind of demonic thing, but he also had this kind of like hedgerow teleportation thing, or hedgerow travel ability that I'd created, where any hedgerow in the neighborhood, he could kind of like disappear into one and reappear in another one and kind of travel, almost like swim through them that way, because he's made of hedgerow, or it's made of hedgerow. And I was like, that's so cool, and I completely forgot to use it, and then they'd killed Binkles, and I was like, cool. And there was also another thing I wanted to use with Binkles, where I wanted to show there's a little bit of backstory for Binkles, which is that Binkles used to be a neutral spirit of that house, of Gerald's house, but it was only when Gerald moved in, which I didn't even really figure out how long ago that was, that Binkles became more and more malevolent over time, to the point where it was this monster. But I kind of wanted the characters to find some of that backstory, where it was maybe like old pictures of like previous residents with Binkles like kind of just like maybe sitting in a family photo or something like that as this benign hedgerow poodle. I just thought that was a nice emotional beat, and so I'm a little bit disappointed I didn't get to use that. And then the last thing was just Gerald himself. Like, I feel like once we got into the final battle with him, I was so focused on the combat and narrating what was happening, and having Gerald take his moves, and reacting to the moves of the characters that I didn't really get any like character moments with him. I think he said like one thing that entire battle, and I would have liked to have more interaction and more maybe like showing why he's doing this and a bit more about his backstory and stuff like that. I felt like as a monster, Gerald went great. I felt like as a character, he was maybe a bit underutilized, which is a bit disappointing. Again, it's my first time doing this stuff, so you live, you learn. And I think it's practice as well. Like, that was my first time running this big fight, and yeah, it was just new to me, and I was having to focus on a lot of things at once, and so something had to slide, and unfortunately it was that. Okay, final questions from Tony. Tony asks, I'd also like to know about how you wrote the game narrative, how your players tried to derail it, and how it got back on track or not. So we've kind of covered this in some places. Like I said, I tried not to write a narrative. I tried to write an antagonist and figure out what they were going to do and then just react. That's kind of how it works with Monster of the Week. So you create your monster and then you create what's called a countdown. So you basically have like, what is that monster's motive and what actions are they going to take if no one interferes? So if the hunters don't interfere, or the hunters aren't there, or if they fail, what are they going to do? What are the different stages of their plan? And so, in fact, I can actually just share what the countdown was with you, although it changed from one session to the other. So, so the original countdown was the inciting incident. So Gerald starts by killing Aileen Ray's cat to threaten her, to try and get her to leave before her house gets foreclosed upon. Because basically Gerald's entire motivation is to maintain the market value and the character of the Sweet Pines residences, like community, the area which is like the dominion of this homeowners association. And like I said, having Aileen Ray's house foreclosed upon would basically decimate the market value of all the properties around it. And so they're trying to prevent that. I should also say that Aileen has a really sympathetic, kind of classic, maybe tragic backstory, in that the reason that her house is being foreclosed upon is that her husband died of cancer, and their medical bills just absolutely decimated their finances, and so she is widowed and is now having to deal with the financial fallout of that. That was the inciting incident. So day for the countdown was that Aileen Ray still hasn't paid her mortgage, so Gerald sends Lawrence Woodhaw to stalk her. He's planning to kill her, basically. And he hopes to kill her before this house goes into foreclosure to prevent that. So that's the first thing that would have happened. Harlow's averted that because when they found out that she was being followed, they took her under his protection. They took her under their protection, so they prevented that. Then Gerald would have gone on to kill Aileen Ray and her son, feed his rosebush with their blood, which would make him stronger, deposit their bodies somewhere outside the Sweet Pines boundary, so it wouldn't affect the market value. And then he was going to move on to purging the HOA board, the committee of two members who he saw as being too kind of lenient and progressive. They were trying to change things in the board, and so he was going to kill them next. And then he was going to send Binkles to kill the Harlows because they were getting in about his business and trying to prevent him from doing things. And then he was going to hang a body in one of the trees in the neighbourhood as a warning to the entire neighbourhood, to basically scare everyone into abiding by all the regulations again. Then I think eventually the last thing was that he was going to become so enraged and frustrated that he and Binkles were just going to start massacring the residents of Sweet Pines, which maybe doesn't work with his goal, because that's probably not going to be great for the market value, but I think it was meant to just be that he was being driven crazy by this. So that was the countdown. That was like what Gerald's kind of progression of the different stages of his plan was, and obviously that didn't happen. Basically I ended up skipping a couple of those steps because as soon as they went to the HOA board and actually spoke to Gerald in person, and Barney was like probing about this cat and the missing creatures, like that immediately had Gerald like, oh shit, they're fucking on to me and they are like sticking their nose into my business. And so he basically immediately skipped to send Binkles to take out the Harlows. And then Binkles failed, obviously. So then Gerald ordered Lawrence to burn down the Ray house. Since he couldn't kill her, he ordered him to burn down the house to prevent that foreclosure on the following Monday, so that the mortgage lender, which was the bank, would get an insurance payout instead. And he's basically given up on killing Ailey and Ray at that point. So now he's entirely focused on killing the Harlows. And so his plan changed to kill the Harlows and then use their bodies as examples to get the rest of Sweet Pines to fall in line, basically a kind of reign of terror. But of course they stopped him. So I think that's the main ways that it changed. It wasn't so much derailing it, it's just that they went to investigate places that I hadn't planned for, and I think I was a little bit frustrated that we didn't actually do as much investigating of the street itself as I expected to. Like there was a moment in particular where the Harlows lived right next door to Gerald, and they could have investigated his rose bush, and if they had gone up to it, they would have found blood on it, that he'd already fed it with blood of one of these neighbourhood pets. And they probably would have then started to figure out, like, oh, something's going on with this rose bush. They were suspicious of the rose bush, but they didn't actually go over to investigate it. They were like, oh, I can see it from there. Can I see anything out of the ordinary? And I was like, no, because you'd have to go over. But if you want to do that, you're going to have to step onto Gerald's garden, like, you know, and potentially have him notice you doing that. And they basically stepped back from that and they were like, no, let's not do that then. And I was like, okay, cool, you've just missed that clue because you were afraid of stepping into his garden. So I think like that was the main issue with like going a bit off the rails and trying to bring them back to the actual clues in the mystery, was that I think I found the most difficult part for me was like figuring out how to respond to the investigate a mystery move. Because I think the first session I didn't really understand how that worked. There were a bunch of times where I had them roll for it and they basically found nothing. Then I did a bit more research before the second session and I was like, oh, that's not really how investigate a mystery works. You're basically just meant to only let them roll if there is something to find there, figure out how to give it to them. Yeah, investigate a mystery was a bit tricky and it did feel like it slowed us down quite a lot in the first session. If I had been on it with that from the get-go, then they maybe would have unraveled things a lot more quickly. But I think that's probably also a result of the fact that I came up with a completely bespoke homebrew weird monster for them. If they were hunting something a lot more traditional, like a vampire or a werewolf or whatever, where there's recognizable clues, the investigation would probably have gone a lot easier. It's just the price of being extra. I think that's it. Okay. Thank you, Cinnamon Bun, for joining me for some D&D chat. I'm going to wrap it up there. 2 things that you might be interested in that I'm going to let you know about. The first is that I have a free plot embryo course on my website at the moment. It is 7 days of free videos introducing you to the concept of the plot embryo and how it works. And you can get that by going to rachelstephen.com/plot, I believe. The other thing is that I do a monthly live stream where we do usually writing sessions, but sometimes it's just chill hangouts and chats and Q&As and stuff, and you can join that for $2 a month if you go to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/RachelStephen. Okay, I'll see you next time. Bye.